Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And now that we have the shortlist and a little bit of dust has settled, I wanted to do a review of the shortlist as it is. So I did an initial reaction to the shortlist having been announced. It was a controversial one for several reasons, but I think at the same time, there is a lot to love about this shortlist. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all of the books here. I've done solo reviews of all of them as well. So if you want a more of an in-depth review of them, please do check those out. But apart from that, I'm going to be going into what that shortlist looks like as a whole, what it maybe sort of says, what key themes seem to be coming up, and choosing my winners and favourites from that as well. So with that all in mind, let's get going talking about these books. So I mentioned at the beginning it was controversial in some ways, and I just wanted to quickly, I suppose, highlight what I mean by that. Mostly it was that Sea Scraper by Benjamin Wood wasn't there, which is a lot of people's favourites. Endling was another book by Maria Reva that a lot of people had really high up as their favourite and was also not on there. And instead as well, we also had Rest of Our Lives, which I'll talk about later, but was a book that was less loved generally overall, or less expected maybe to be part of the shortlist. And so I'm going to talk about all of these books all together, but it's interesting thematically seeing how they all sort of hinge together, because there are so many things going on that were happening in the long list as well as definitely in the short list around the ways we tell narratives. So as I'll talk about in a bit, some of the narratives that really explore telling stories from completely different perspectives, or the ways that truth is hidden from us, or even the ways that we look back at our own histories, perhaps with less than a kind of believable sense. We may be getting things wrong about various parts of our own histories, and that's what comes up a lot in these books. So I want to talk a little bit about these and look at it as a whole. So let's get going talking about them in alphabetical order. So first up we have Flashlight by Susan Choi, and this is a book that really over the course of many years looks at a family's history, and particularly the various ways that broader geopolitics influence the micro sort of lives of everybody involved. So what we see particularly in this book is the way that this impacts several generations of a family. We start by looking at a young child who is trying to understand their place in the world, particularly because there is this whole thing about Koreanness in the face of being around Japanese people, or being one of the only Korean people. And as the young child and various other kids in the book come to learn a little bit more about their history as Koreans, they realize the impacts of various broader things. So Japanese occupation, for example, or in the more modern day, looking at particularly things around North and South Korea and various other things that come up. But what really happens, particularly sort of in the middle of the book and towards the end, is that we focus a lot on the father of a couple of the characters in the book, who is, we see his journey essentially as somebody who is in North Korea, is part of essentially being in a work camp and is trying to do whatever he can to survive. But however, when he leaves that environment, he is seen as suspicious, because he is somebody who has been he's seen as almost he's not like skinny and emaciated enough in people's eyes to be really a North Korean, was somebody who survived a North Korean camp, because he's managed to find a job that gives him a little bit of extra food here and there. And so the fact that he's not fully emaciated makes him suspicious to them, because they think, well, he clearly must have been siding with the communists to be able to do this. And so what I think is quite interesting across the length of this book is the way that the various characters are always slightly out of place. So he is not deemed as suffering enough to be a real sort of prisoner in a sort of camp, a work camp in North Korea. Parts of his family are not seen as being Korean enough in various places, or not fitting in enough in various other places. And I think the book threads that all together really interestingly. And although I did find parts of the book a bit bloated personally, I still think there's something really gorgeous about the family epic going on in this book, and particularly the various ways that characters wish well or don't wish well for each other. And without spoiling anything towards the end of the book, there are a fair few things about how you are remembered, and if you want to be remembered, or if you want people to know the true you at the point of death. And I think that all gets wrapped together really beautifully into this book. And there's a lot in here about trying to work out who you are and how you exist in a world that maybe isn't friendly to you. Next up, we have Kiran Desai with The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny. And so she is a former winner, Kiran Desai, and this book in many ways feels like it has a meta element to it, because in the book we are watching as Sonia is trying to write and is struggling with various expectations placed on her. Several of those expectations also seem to impact Kiran Desai's life, and there's something quite interesting about the way this book has been pitched, because quite often it frames things around a book 20 years in the making, partly because in the story it takes about that length of time for the characters, but also for Kiran Desai, this is her first book in about 15, well, just under 20 years, I think. And so it's about 19 years since she won the Booker. And so there's also something going on here about this idea of the role of the author, and particularly Kiran Desai and Sonia having some overlap. But I think what is particularly interesting about this book, that is this sweeping history of these two characters' lives in a sort of will they, won't they, of trying to work out if Sonia and Sunny will ever be together, if they're doomed to not be together, and this idea of fate or whatever playing into it, is also these other quite interesting things that I think happen in the book. And for me, the love story going on between Sonia and Sunny was interesting in and of itself, but I think the book is interesting for other things as well. The love story is really about Sonia, who is living in the US and feels some degree of homesickness, but is also torn between various ways of existing. She starts to enter into a relationship with this really horrible man called Ilan, I think, and he is horrible for many, many reasons. But one thing that really plays in her mind quite early into the book is he essentially says that she shouldn't be orientalizing herself. She shouldn't be writing about India as being full of sort of mangoes and guavas and peacocks and all of these things. She should be looking at writing a different kind of India. But she's then caught in various ways, because there is a sense of she can write about India in a way that she knows and loves. There's also the kind of India that she could write about that the public would love, in this kind of orientalizing way of writing about all these luscious things. And there are all these various truths between those two things, equally for how she writes about the US. At the same time, Sunny is in and out of relationships, is sort of unsure about how these things all work for him. And they're both slightly adrift and unsure of who they are. And in some ways, the transatlantic, I guess, nature of this, well, further than transatlantic, but the fact that they're both in the US and in India in various parts, and they sometimes feel that they have a bit of a foot in both, but never quite fully standing in either one, is a big part of how they come together as two people who don't really understand what's going on around them and kind of cling to each other, but also need each other and all these other things. But I think there's something also really interesting on a meta level happening. As I mentioned, this idea of orientalizing herself, and actually it feels almost like a struggle for Kiran Desai to be able to write about the US and India, where she's lived in both, and to understand how she can write about either without falling down the typical tropes of writing in those ways. You know, this is an author who has a book with guava in the title, and so there's something interesting about the way that her first two novels exist in this world where suddenly there was a huge appetite in the West for Indian authors and a very typical way of framing Indian writing. And this book almost feels like a writing back in a way that I think is fascinating, because it acknowledges that and seeks to understand where that leaves authors as well. So I think there's a lot more going on with this book, as well as just being a really sweeping, epic story of two lovers. And I found it really funny and really wise, and at times really silly in a good way, but also with a strong intellectual core as well. So I really enjoyed this book. And I'm not surprised in many ways that it's on the shortlist, because I think it has something very interesting to say. Next up, we have Katie Kitamura with Audition. And this book, I think, has split the room somewhat. It is a book that is a bit of a head scratcher in what I thought was a good way, but I see how this is incredibly divisive. I tried and perhaps failed in my solo review of this book to really get to the heart of what I think it's trying to do. But the core idea is that there are two parts of this novel, almost written as two acts, and that is important for various reasons. Partly, as the name Audition suggests, we are dealing with the world of theatre as well in this. And we have a character right from the beginning of the book trying to understand some kind of odd relationship. And the reader is very much on the back foot here because we know nothing and not much is made clear to us for parts of this novel. But essentially, the book starts with a young woman who I think is unnamed for the entire book. And she is watching as somebody comes into a cafe who she is due to meet. They have coffee, but she also sees her partner elsewhere in the cafe. And essentially it starts to unpick these various stories about who he might be. Without going into too many spoilers, really, a big part of it is that he is claiming to be her son. And in the first act of the book, this is seen as completely unworkable and unrealistic because she has, in her mind, at least as how she's telling the story, and perhaps she's unreliable as a narrator, she is saying that she's never been pregnant or never given birth or anything along these lines. And it all hinges on an interview that she gave where she talks about having an abortion. And when she talks about having the abortion, she refers to it as losing a child. And this young man reads this and thinks that she lost the child, as in the child was given away, and therefore thinks that he is related to her. But then the book switches into the second act, where some of the truths, I guess, or kind of establishing story that we had in the first act seem to no longer be true or seem to be slightly different, because now there is a familial situation in which he is very much seen as the son. And it starts to blur these various worlds. And I mean, the ending is, I think, one that many essays will be written about. I think there's a lot of discussion to be had about it. But, and again, without spoiling anything, I think the ending of the book then throws into relief how any of this might be false or true. It may well be that both acts of the book are false and are different versions of something fictionalized, created by either Katie Kitamura, the author, or the playwrights in this book. And there are several people who are writing bits of writing plays in the book. But then you also have the potential that Act 1 is true and Act 2 is a creation, or vice versa, or neither is true, or both are true in some other weird world. And I think that's what really gets kind of going in this book in a really interesting way, is this idea of audition is then potentially of, are we putting out various forms of narrative and auditioning them to see which feels better, which feels like the more stable version of the truth. And I think it's just really interesting in many ways. I don't know if I got the book right, if that's ever possible with a book. I don't know if I fully understood what was going on, but I was utterly convinced by the book. There's something about the conviction with which the book talks that I found utterly captivating. It's a book that I think has a very sure tone of voice that in many ways is there to lure you down garden paths and not know what's going on. I found it utterly baffling and captivating in equal measure. And I think the book does a lot in terms of playing around with narrative and particularly what we take as given as a reader as well. I think it's really interesting. I see why people hate it. I really enjoyed it because I like the tricksiness of it. Next, we have The Rest of Our Lives by Ben Markovitz. And this is the book that maybe had the most confusion, maybe around it being shortlisted. It's a weird one in several ways. I enjoyed reading the book. I just don't know how much depth I found in reading it. But then something that's interesting about this is the judges for the Booker Prize this year spoke about how it really improved on a second read. And that got me thinking about whether there's something else going on here that I just entirely missed. And I've seen a couple of people compare it to sort of like an Ann Tyler or Elizabeth Strout in the sense of not much seems to be happening, but there are little things going on under the hood that are really interesting. And okay with having that as a potential reading of this. Although I will say, for me personally, Elizabeth Strout and Tyler, I feel like there's something more dynamic going on than what I found necessarily in this book. But anyway, that's a lot of preamble. The Rest of Our Lives is the story of a man who is having, to some degree, a later life crisis. So he's dealing with various health problems that he is overlooking. He has continuous issues, particularly with his heart, but also various other things around his joints seem to be quite tricky. He seems to constantly be getting these bits of inflammation or feeling really rough, particularly when he wakes up. And there's this whole thing where his family seem to be incredibly concerned for him. And at the same time, he has long buried and sort of swallowed this feeling of dejection because his wife had an affair sort of many years before, and he had always told himself he would wait until his youngest child turned 18, went off to uni or went off to wherever else, and then he would start the process of leaving his wife. He'd been holding on to that for so long, and there's an idea that maybe it's linked to his health, that there's a stress that is so buried that it's kind of contained. And what starts off then from there is he goes on essentially a road trip, at least at first nominally to go and visit his children and to sort of see parts of the US, but it doesn't really go much further. He only travels really a couple of states. He spends a lot of time talking to people and playing basketball, and that's kind of what really happens. And there is something kind of interesting and funny, I think, in the sense that he has this big road trip or this big dynamic changing of a life planned, and it's something much smaller. You know, the way that we often think about these is the sort of eat, pray, love of, you know, going out and having this giant adventure and rediscovering yourself. And for him, it's driving through a couple of states, playing a bit of basketball and feeling a bit dejected, and also having people around him worry about his health. And so there's something interesting, I think, in that. It's kind of a comical inversion of the typical road trip, change your life kind of thing, particularly because ultimately the idea is that he'll probably come back and be back with his wife anyhow. He doesn't seem to really understand what he might do next. He's, I think, in his either late 50s or early 60s, and so there's a real sense that starting his brand new life now is maybe flawed as an idea. And I did enjoy reading this. I thought this was really captivating and interesting as I was reading it. I think I just felt like I was waiting for something big, and then suddenly there was quite an abrupt end for the book. And that, I think, is what a fair few people have felt about the book's inclusion on the shortlist, has been the kind of wanting that little extra push at the end, that little extra penny drop that makes the book feel like a big literary book, or makes it feel like it's going for something. And I think that was my frustration, is I felt that the book had goaded me into a literary payoff that didn't come. And maybe that's the point, maybe because life doesn't always have these big literary payoffs. But I think I found that a little underwhelming at the end. So I still think it's a good book. I still found it enjoyable. I just think that there are books, personally, that I would have preferred to see on the shortlist ahead of this, that felt like they pushed the needle just a little bit further in terms of literature as well. Not every book has to do that. Not every book has to be, you know, a big, giant thought piece or think piece on something. But yeah, I just kind of wanted a little bit more, essentially. Next up, we have The Land in Winter by Andrew Miller. And this is an historical novel that particularly looks at a post-World War II Britain, and particularly focuses in on a small town, or kind of really a village, that is dealing with the effects of a winter, hence the title. And what we see start to emerge from this is something very subtle and I think really probing and interesting, which is around the idea of buried secrets, but also those secrets linked to World War II. And so what we see, for example, are various characters who are in this novel who are not seen as necessarily coming from another place, but have maybe changed their name. One of them is a Hungarian Jew who has moved to this town and is going by a new name, and so therefore passes under the radar, even though previously, you know, Hungary and and particularly the fact that this person is Jewish is very pertinent to this idea of World War II and the movement of people, particularly around the Holocaust. And so what we start to see are little crumbs thrown in front of us that start to lead us down a trail of something else. So what starts as a very quiet book where everyone seems very happy in their relationships for the most part, we soon come to learn that nothing is as it seems. The two couples who we're introduced to at the beginning have far more secrets going on, and they are far from living the happy, relaxed life that you would expect. The winter that appears starts to problematize various other things that are happening, where suddenly somebody who is pregnant is thinking about potentially escaping, but the winter potentially jeopardizes all of those plans. And the other little things start to emerge in this, particularly the idea of looking back at things like the Holocaust and concentration camps, and how somebody could live next to something like that and not know what's going on. And the book probes at this from various different angles, I think, in a really interesting way that I just loved, where I think the book occasionally just drops in a little reference to Bergen-Belsen, for example, and then leaves that there and maybe picks that back up 30, 40, 50, 100 pages later. But with this idea that you can't always fully grasp the secrets of what's happening around you, that actually for people in nearby towns, did they necessarily know what was happening in the camps? And there are often reports going both ways about that. But this idea of actually something bigger is happening over here that is a shameful and horrifying thing. And we now have to live with the scars of that and think about what that means for the next generation. What does it mean to be a group of people growing up in the shadow of something like that and continuing on as if life is fine? This book is set in, I think, the early 60s. And so there's a sense of a generation who are born just as World War II is happening, or just after World War II, who are now just about old enough to maybe reckon with the horrors of it, but it is something that the previous generation do not talk about. And that is something I found really fascinating about this book, is there's a subtlety and a quietness to this book that permeates everything in the way that a set of snow would sort of dampen down everything that's happening, but there is something lurking underneath that is far more sinister. And I think that's what I found fascinating about the book, the parallels that are drawn here between this idea that actually a post-World War II Britain is thinking that everything's going to be fine now. We are on the side of the victors and we're on the side of the good, and we are now going to live these good and effective and peaceful lives, but there's something else going on that is far more sinister still. Something has not settled. Something is not quite right. And I really just adored the way the book does this. I think it's so deeply clever, whilst also just being an enjoyable historical novel. I found the book really interesting as just on its plain sort of basic surface of what's going on in the book. I thought that was brilliant. And then the little kernels of what else it's dropping into this about the kind of idea of never again, but what is happening for the characters in their lives, I thought was so interesting, particularly for various characters who are trying to escape some of the situations that they're in this book. I thought this was brilliant, and I really loved this. And last but not least, we have Flesh by David Zaloy. And this is a novel about a young man, at least at the beginning of the book, called Istvan, who is, at least for the first part of the book, is caught up in a set of actions that then go on to dominate the rest of his life. He is having essentially some kind of affair with an older woman. She is in a relationship. He accidentally, things eventually happen that lead to somebody's death, and he ends up with a criminal record. The criminal record and the shame of everything else that's gone on in his life then dogs him for the entire rest of the book. And it shows up in really fascinating ways. So we then see him moving to London and starting a job, and starting various jobs. And in those jobs, he's sometimes working slightly above board, sometimes slightly underboard, very underboard in many ways. And they are ways that he is just getting through and making sure that his life is as squeaky clean as possible, whilst also doing some things that are very much not squeaky clean. And in many ways, we just start to see how this impacts his life. I think there's something really fascinating going on with form and function in this book. whole book is told by somebody who seemingly does not care about giving us the details of his every action. And in many ways, it feels like a very closed off, stoic man who I might know. There are men I've met who are like him, who you sort of like, how was your weekend? Oh yeah, fine. And then you find out actually that weekend they saw their kids and they did all these things that would be huge. Instead, what we get is somebody who is slightly emotionally cut off for most of the book. And that seems to spark from this idea that being emotionally cut off is the thing that aids this man's survival. Istvan kind of gets through life because he is cut off from his emotions. He doesn't process the bad things about what he's doing in his job. He doesn't think about some of these other things because to do so has got him into trouble before. And the book is told in this very clipped style where you'll have things like okay or very short lines, and then immediately a new line in the text. It reads almost very quickly because it's full of these very, very short lines where he almost does not seem to be committed at all to telling us a story. At various points, a chapter will change and you learn that 3 years or something have gone past in that chapter. And between those two chapters, huge life moments have happened, sometimes involving weddings or children being born or various other things, somebody dying. All of these things happen in the spaces between chapters, and he seems to not want to tell us any of the information about that. And I found that fascinating as a text. It doesn't always make for the most pleasant reading experience, but I think that's the point. These are the thoughts of a man who is not interested in telling us in lurid detail everything that's happened to him. He has emotions and he feels them, but those are things that you lock away and you do not show other people. He can maybe be happy and proud that he has a child or that other people in his life are doing well or whatever, but he does not need to tell us this. These are just things that he moves through and he's on to the next thing, because survival for him is just about getting to the next thing. It's just about providing for a family or making sure he's got enough money for things, not being flashy, just making money, doing his thing, moving on. And so I thought this book was fascinating. I get that on the surface, this also makes it a really unappealing book at the same time, because there is almost a purposeful subversion of any expectation. We expect a narrator to want to tell us the details, or if they're hiding details from us, there is a broader literary point and the secrets all come out later anyway. Whereas for him, he doesn't seem to be bothered to tell us that something big has happened in his life. We have to find that out through context clues later, where we realize he is actually married, and that happened 2 years ago, but that was between chapters, so we don't need to know. We don't need to know what color the sky was, or the dress, or the suit he wore, or any of those details. He is going to keep that hidden from us. And I think that is what is utterly fascinating for me about this, the kind of emotional bluntness that he has adopted to survive in his world. And in many ways, I found it an interesting critique of the way that men, particularly heterosexual men, find a place within the world, that there is a way that they are often told that emotions are problematic or troublesome, and actually the way to deal with it is to sort of have a routine and to get through and just do your thing that you need to do and be very work focused. And so I found him fascinating as a narrator, even though the point is that he's so not interesting in many ways, because he doesn't want to be. He wants to resist all of that, and that's what I think is brilliant about this book. So although it's an odd reading experience, for me, I think this is genius, because it all feels like a critique. All of his emotional withholding, all of his intensity around various things, all of his coldness around other things, the misogyny that he espouses and shows in various parts of this book, I think all lead towards a bigger point being made about he is a certain type of man who does these things to survive how he can. And we're not meant to love him, I don't think, or to really like him in various ways, but I think he provides a broader critique of something else, and that's what I think is fascinating. And that I think this could only have been delivered through fiction. I don't think this is something that could have been done through non-fiction, and that's what I think is brilliant about this book. So anyway, those are the 6 books on this shortlist. As you can probably tell from the length of conversation I've had about various ones of these, there are various ones that I love. a lot more here. But I think thematically it's really interesting, particularly from the long list. But in the short list, I think we see a lot about this idea of the ways that secrets are hidden, or the ways that narrative presents things. And I'm particularly interested in this shortlist by the ways that various books take completely different forms of narrative here. The fact that you've got something like The Land in Winter with this quiet approach, the slightly more kind of ludicrous or kind of offbeat thing of something like The Rest of Our Lives, Flesh having this quiet kind of stoic character that doesn't want to tell you the details, versus Flashlight, where we get this big historical sweeping epic. The same for something like The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, where we get these rich details and we get these two narratives going alongside each other. And then something like Audition that kind of just throws a hand grenade at the very idea of being understood. I think all of these together make for a really interesting shortlist. And although there are some books I would personally have probably swapped out, there are 4 here that I really love and would really happily see win. And the other 2, I mean, maybe less Rest of Your Lives. I'm not sure if I'd necessarily be happy to see it win. Flashlight, I totally understand as well. Understand this, it sort of winning on that respect. But I think for me, the themes of these books are so interesting, and the ways that, particularly, there's a lot going on around how we tell stories and how we think of the truth and how we think of history and various other things. So all of that I think is fascinating. I will say personally, from my favourites, I mean, I mentioned the 4 that I'd quite happily see win. So Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, Audition, Land in Winter, and Flesh, personally for me. Of all of those, I think I would love to see either Flesh or The Land in Winter take it, just because of how those books personally affected me and how I enjoyed the ways they told stories. But I also wouldn't be surprised to see Audition take it, partly because I think as well this is a book that requires rereading, and I've not yet reread it, but I would be intrigued to see how it lands, knowing that we maybe distrust parts of the book, because I went into the second act of this book really confused at how it seemed to have subverted various truths presented in the first part. But then I wonder if on a reread you then distrust the first part slightly more and you look at the second part in a different way. I think there's a lot going on. And by this point, so the judges have read all of the long list twice. And so now they are going to begin the third read of all of the shortlisted books. And I'm intrigued to see which books really stack up once they have an additional read on them. I would not be surprised to see, I mean, I suppose if they've made it to shortlist, it's no surprise if any of them wins, really. But I think at the same time, my personal choices would be Flesh and Land in Winter, and maybe Audition. I think my prediction is potentially more on the side of Audition, just because I think it's a book that on multiple reads would take different avenues. I also wonder if something like a big book, like an epic like Flashlight or The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, on multiple reads, there's so much that you are reading and so many pages of a world that you're living in, whether that would impact something. But my overall prediction, I think, is maybe either Audition or I think Flesh. I think Flesh would be interesting on multiple reads, and I think has something dynamic to it that is utterly fascinating. So I kind of hope and think, predict that it might be there, but who knows? I am almost always wrong on these things, so it's almost now definitely going to be Rest of Our Lives because I've said every other book. So there we go. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your predictions, particularly any sort of things that you found interesting about this shortlist. And look, again, I don't think this is, for me, my favourite shortlist of the long-listed books. It's not far off. It's 4 of the books that I would love to have seen on it. But I'd be intrigued to see how this all stacks up, particularly when we look at it in many years to come. I think that's been the interesting thing about my Booker project, has been to look back and to see how these books how sort of former shortlists have landed and whether they've stood the test of time. And that in many ways is something that the judges are looking for. Is this a book that in many years we will consider a classic? And I do wonder from these 6 how they'll be viewed in the future. I'm also still doing my project, and I've been doing for the last few years, where all of the books that are shortlisted, I try to read another book, if it exists, by that author. And so I've read one already by Ben Markovits that I read a few years ago, You Don't Have to Live Like This, which I really liked. And I'm intrigued now to read books by the other 5 authors as well. So we shall see. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Take care and speak to you all very soon. Bye-bye.